Elias Vance was not a hero. He was a ghost, a man hollowed out by the echoes of a war that had ended nearly a decade ago but continued to rage behind his eyes. He had chosen solitude not as a comfort, but as a shield. His ranch, a lonely speck of battered wood and stubborn dirt, wedged between the vast Texas sky and an unforgiving earth, was less a home and more a fortress against a world he no longer understood or trusted. Here, the only ghosts were the ones he brought with him, their silent accusations, a familiar hum beneath the whine of the prairie wind. But the world, like a persistent creditor, always finds a way to collect, and today the world had come calling. His supply of flour had turned to dust, his coffee was a memory, and the jerky he'd been living on was as tough and unforgiving as his own heart. The ride into Dust Devil Gulch was a necessary evil, a grim pilgrimage he made only when the emptiness of his pantry became more threatening than the emptiness of other men's souls. He guided his horse, Bones, down the town's single rutted street, his eyes narrowed against the glare. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the unpainted storefronts and turning the air into a shimmering haze of heat and flies. It was a town that smelled of stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap despair. Men leaned in shadowed doorways, their eyes vacant, their hands never far from the guns at their hips. Women scurried past, heads bowed, as if afraid the very sunlight would find them guilty of something. It was the laughter that caught his ear first, not the warm, rolling laughter of good fellowship, but something brittle and cruel. It drew a small crowd near the sheriff's office, a circle of bored, callous faces, seeking any distraction from the crushing monotony of their lives. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his gut, the instinct to turn Bones around and ride back to the silence of his land. But his feet were already on the ground, his body moving forward with a grim inertia. He pushed through the outer ring of onlookers, his shoulders easily parting the lesser men, and then he saw her. She was tied to the hitching post, the one usually reserved for horses too, ornery to stand still. An Apache woman. Her clothes were little more than sun-bleached rags, clinging to a frame made sharp by starvation. Her black hair was matted with grime and dust, her skin burned raw in places, her lips cracked and bleeding. The rough hemp rope had bitten into her wrists, leaving angry purple welts. The heat, the hunger, the humiliation, it was enough to break any soul. But when Elias looked at her eyes, he saw no plea. There was no fear, no begging for mercy. There was only a fire, a deep, ancient blaze of defiance that seemed to burn away all the filth and degradation. She stared straight ahead, through the mocking crowd, through the miserable town, as if seeing the distant mesas of a home she would never reach again. She was a queen on a throne of suffering, and her silence was more powerful than any scream. Sheriff Bodine, a man whose gut spilled over his gun belt, leaned against the doorframe, chewing on a piece of straw. He saw Elias and gave a lazy, contemptuous grin. "Well now, Vance, come to see the show?" He gestured with his thumb toward the woman, found her wandering near the reservation line. "Property of the government, I suppose. But they don't want her back." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She's the last of her kind, they say. Useless. Can't even get a day's work out of her." The sheriff pushed himself off the wall, his voice rising to project to the small, eager crowd. $5, he bellowed, a cruel auctioneer selling a broken thing. $5, and you can take this Apache refuse off my hands. Might make a good scarecrow. A wave of ugly snickers rippled through the onlookers. Any other man would have turned away, disgusted or indifferent. Any other man would have gone about his business, bought his flour, and forgotten her by sundown. But Elias Vance was a different kind of man. He had seen enough cruelty in his life to recognize its face, but he had also seen enough courage to recognize its soul. And in the silent, unbroken gaze of this woman, he saw a spirit that mirrored the most stubborn, principled part of his own. He saw a soul that refused to kneel. The world seemed to fall silent. The wind died down. The jeering stopped. All that existed was the space between Elias and the sheriff. Without a word, Elias reached into the worn leather pouch at his belt. His calloused fingers, accustomed to the heft of a rifle and the grip of reins, counted out the coins. He stepped forward, the crowd parting before him like a filthy tide. He didn't look at them. His eyes were locked on Bodine. He placed the coins on the sheriff's dusty desk, one by one. The clink of each silver dollar was a final, damning judgment. 5 coins, $5. Bodine stared at the money, then at Elias, his smug expression melting into confusion. "You damned fool," he whispered. "What are you going to do with that?" Elias didn't answer. He turned, drew the hunting knife from his belt, and walked directly to the post. He cut the ropes with 2 swift, clean strokes. The woman didn't flinch. She stood, slowly, her legs unsteady but her back straight as an arrow. She looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes acknowledged his existence. He saw no gratitude, no fear. He saw only a silent question. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the end of the street, toward the open prairie beyond. He turned and walked toward his horse, not looking back to see if she followed. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence behind him, a shadow of defiant pride in his wake. As he mounted Bones, he knew what the town was thinking. They thought he'd bought a slave, a plaything, a beast of burden, but they were wrong. Elias Vance hadn't bought property. He had just paid a ransom, freeing a captive soul he had recognized as his own. If you believe that one act of defiance can change everything, comment number 1 down below. And if you're new here, saddle up and hit that subscribe button to help us reach 1,000 riders on this trail. Now, Elias has brought her home, but the silence in that cabin is louder than any gunshot. The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a deafening silence. It was a silence deeper than the one Elias had cultivated for 9 years, a quiet so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He rode ahead, his back ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could burn a hole through it with the force of his will. He did not look back. He didn't need to. He could feel her behind him, a steady, ghost-like presence. She did not walk like a victim. Her steps were measured, her pace unwavering, matching the gait of his horse without complaint. She was not following him. She was simply moving in the same direction, a parallel line drawn in the dust that would never intersect. The sun beat down, merciless and white-hot. The landscape was a blur of cracked earth and skeletal mesquite. The only sounds were the plodding of Bones's hooves, the creak of old leather, and the whisper of the wind, a sound that suddenly felt crowded, as if it were carrying the unspoken words of the woman walking in his shadow. When they finally reached the ranch, the structure looked smaller, more vulnerable than it had that morning. It was his fortress, his sanctuary of solitude, and he had just willingly led a stranger through its gates. He dismounted, the movement stiff, automatic. He did not offer her a hand. He did not offer her a word. He simply walked to the cabin door and pushed it open, holding it for a moment before stepping inside. She paused on the threshold, her dark eyes sweeping over the Spartan interior. One room, a hard-packed dirt floor, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, a stone fireplace, cold and black. A cot in the corner with a single threadbare blanket folded with military precision. This was his world, functional, hard, and stripped of all comfort. It was a visual map of his own soul. She stepped inside, as silent as smoke, and the room changed. It was no longer just his. The air was suddenly thick with another life, another history, another silence that challenged his own. Elias moved to the stove. He took a piece of salted jerky from a tin, poured a ladle of water from the bucket into a tin cup, and placed them on the table. It was not an offering of kindness. It was a transaction. He had paid $5. This was the fulfillment of his end of the unspoken bargain. He had removed her from immediate harm. Now, she had to choose to live. He turned his back on her then, busying himself with unsaddling Bones, giving her the illusion of privacy, giving himself a reason not to watch. He did not know what he had just done. The thought hammered at him, a relentless rhythm against the inside of his skull. What have you done? He had brought a danger home. Not the danger of a knife in the back while he slept, but something far more insidious. He had brought the world with him. He could hear the voices, ghosts from his past, swirling in the sudden quiet of the barn. He heard the voice of his old sergeant, a man made of gravel and pragmatism. A loose end, Vance. Never leave a loose end. It'll get you killed. She was a loose end, a piece of government property, a woman whose people had been at war with his for generations. Someone would come looking, Bloodline, for sport, soldiers, for duty, or worse, men who saw a lone woman as an opportunity. He had not saved her. He had merely moved her cage. Then he heard the jeering laughter from the town, the word Bloodline had used, refuse. They saw her as less than human, a piece of trash to be discarded. And in that moment, a different voice rose inside him, one of iron and cold fury. It was the voice that had kept him alive in the war, the part of him that despised bullies and cheap cruelty. He had acted on that voice, that raw, primal instinct to stand against the ugliness of men. But that instinct was for the battlefield. Out here, in the quiet of the plains, it was a liability. He had lived by a simple code for 9 years. Mind your own business. Interfere with nothing. Expect nothing. Offer nothing. In the space of 5 minutes, he had broken every single one of his own rules. He walked back into the cabin. The jerky and water sat on the table, untouched. She was sitting in the single chair, her back as straight as a rifle barrel. She wasn't looking at the food. She was looking at him. Her gaze was not accusatory. It was not grateful. It was utterly, terrifyingly neutral. It was the gaze of an animal watching a predator, waiting to see if it would attack. He realized with a jolt that she didn't trust the food. For all she knew, it was poisoned. For all she knew, he was just another white man with a different, more patient kind of cruelty. The thought was a punch to the gut. The conflict raging inside him wasn't about regret. He didn't regret the $5. He'd have paid $50. It was about responsibility. A grim, unwanted weight that had settled upon him the moment he cut her ropes. He had ripped her from one fate, and in doing so had made himself responsible for her next one. What was he supposed to do? Turn her loose on the prairie? She would be dead in 2 days from thirst or starvation, or worse, found by men less principled than Sheriff Bloodline. Could he keep her here? His ranch was a sanctuary of solitude, not a refuge. Her presence was a stone thrown into the still, dark pool of his life, and the ripples were spreading, threatening to swamp him. The first day bled into the second. He worked. He mended a section of fence that had been leaning for months, the familiar rhythm of hammer and staple a small comfort. He chopped wood, stacking it with a precision that bordered on obsession. He cleaned his rifle, the scent of gun oil and worn steel, a familiar prayer. And through it all she sat. She did not move. She did not eat. She did not drink. Her stillness was a monumental act of will, a silent challenge. He would leave fresh water, new food. It remained untouched. By the evening of the second day, a cold knot of dread was tightening in his stomach. He was watching her die. He had saved her from a quick, public death, only to subject her to a slow, private one in his own home. On the morning of the third day, he couldn't stand it anymore. He walked to the well, drew a fresh bucket of water, and brought it inside. He set it on the floor near her. Then he took a piece of bread. He had baked a rare act he performed, only when the loneliness became a physical hunger, and he broke it in half. He ate one half himself, slowly, deliberately, right in front of her. Then he placed the other half on the table. He looked directly at her. "Eat," he said. The word was rough, rusty from disuse. It was not a command, it was a plea. He turned and left the cabin, unable to watch. He didn't know if she was an enemy or an ally, a curse or a blessing. All he knew was that her silence was screaming, and his solitude was no longer a fortress. It was a cage, and now there were 2 of them trapped inside. This wasn't kindness, It wasn't charity. It was a ceasefire, a tense, fragile truce between two exhausted souls, waiting to see which one would break first. He's offered her food, but she's offered only silence. Whose will do you think is stronger? Let us know by commenting. Number 2. If you're feeling the tension build, hit that like button and share this story with someone who loves a true tale of grit. Subscribing ensures you won't miss what happens when that silence finally breaks. Because a change is coming not from a word, but from an action. He did not go back inside. Not right away. Elias Vance stood outside the cabin as the sun began its slow, bleeding retreat across the horizon, painting the vast, indifferent sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. He could not face the silence in that room again, could not face the possibility that his single, desperate word had fallen on ears that had already decided to stop listening. He felt the familiar grip of futility, the same cold companion that had followed him home from the war. What good was one small act against a world built on cruelty? He had seen men die for less than a piece of bread. He had seen lives snuffed out for a wrong look, a disputed card, or for nothing at all. He had bought her from a slow, public execution and brought her to a slow, private one. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. He walked to the corral, his movements heavy, his mind a battlefield of accusing voices. He leaned against the rough-hewn fence, the splinters digging into his forearms, a welcome, grounding pain. He stared out at the endless expanse of his land, a kingdom of dust and solitude that had once felt like a reprieve, but now felt like a prison. For 9 years, this silence had been his shield. Tonight, it felt like his accomplice. The minutes stretched into an hour. The stars, cold and distant as a general's medals, began to pierce the deepening dark. The prairie wind whispered through the dry grass, and for the first time it sounded like a lament. Finally, he could bear it no longer. The not knowing was a worse torment than any certainty. Steeling himself, he turned and walked back to the cabin, each step a leaden weight. He pushed the door open without a sound. The cabin was cast in deep shadow, the only light a pale silver shaft from the moon falling through the single grimy window. He stood on the threshold, his eyes adjusting, his heart hammering against his ribs, and then he saw it. The tin cup on the table was empty, the half-slice of bread was gone. Relief washed over him, so sudden and absolute, it almost brought him to his knees. It was not joy, it was not triumph. It was the simple, profound release of a man who had been holding his breath for 3 days. A single, ragged exhale escaped his lips. She was still alive. She had chosen to live. He looked over to the chair where she had sat like a statue carved from defiance. It was empty. His gaze darted to the corner, to his cot. She was there, huddled under his worn blanket, a small, still shape in the darkness. She had taken his bed. The thought came unbidden, and with it a strange, unidentifiable emotion. He had offered food. She had taken his space. He turned and walked back outside, pulling the door quietly shut. He would sleep in the barn. A new, unspoken set of rules was being written, and he found he did not have the will to argue with them. The change, once it began, was like a desert river after a flash flood. It started as a trickle and quickly carved a new landscape. The next morning, when he emerged from the barn, he saw her at the well. Her movements were slow, her limbs still stiff with weakness, but there was a fierce deliberation in them. She struggled with the weight of the wooden bucket, her thin arms trembling with the effort, but she did not stop. She drew the water herself. Elias watched from the shadow of the barn, unseen. He had left a full bucket for her inside. Her refusal to use it was a declaration. I am not helpless. I will draw my own water. Then she did something that stopped him cold. She took the tattered, filthy rags she wore, the uniform of her humiliation, and began to wash them in the horse trough. Her hands, small and scarred, worked the rough fabric against the wood, scrubbing with a methodical patience that was mesmerizing. She was not just washing away the dirt of the road or the grime of the jail post. She was scouring away the touch of her captors, erasing the scent of the town's contempt, reclaiming her own skin. Elias felt a reluctant admiration stir within him. This was not a broken thing. This was a person meticulously, painstakingly, putting herself back together, piece by piece, right in front of him. He had seen hardened soldiers crumble under less than what she had endured. Her quiet, stubborn resilience was a force of nature. When he returned to the cabin that afternoon after a long ride checking his perimeter fences, he stopped dead on the threshold. The room was different. The hard-packed dirt floor, which he hadn't properly swept in years, was clean. The film of dust that had coated every surface was gone. His 2 tin plates and cups, which usually sat where he'd last used them, were washed and stacked neatly on the small shelf near the fireplace. His spare shirt, which had been tossed in a corner, was folded and placed at the foot of the cot she had claimed as her own. She had taken his chaotic, neglected space and imposed an order upon it. He felt a strange prickle of something. It wasn't anger. It wasn't annoyance at the intrusion. It felt like he had walked into the wrong house, a place that resembled his own but belonged to someone else. His solitude had been a reflection of the chaos in his soul, a carefully maintained state of disarray. She, with her silent, purposeful actions, had brought a quiet logic to it. It was deeply unsettling. She was not behaving like a servant, currying favor. She was behaving like a partner, tending to a shared space. It was a conversation without words, her actions saying what her voice would not. If we are to live here, we will live with dignity. We will have order. Several more days passed in this new, charged silence. A routine began to form, unspoken but mutually understood. He would hunt or work the land. She would tend to the cabin, and she had begun to clear a small patch of ground near the well, her fingers sifting through the dry soil as if searching for a memory of life. They ate at the same table, a new chair, a hastily repaired one from the barn, now sitting opposite his. The silence was no longer a hostile void between them, but a shared territory, a space filled with the quiet hum of 2 people coexisting. One evening, a week after her arrival, they sat at the table as the fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Elias was cleaning his rifle, the familiar metallic scent filling the small space. She was mending a tear in his blanket, her stitches small and neat. The quiet was comfortable, almost peaceful. He had just finished reassembling the firing mechanism when she stopped her work. She laid the blanket aside and looked directly at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Enola. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Her voice was hoarse, rough from disuse, but it was clear and steady. It was the first word she had spoken to him. The first word she had spoken since he'd found her. Elias froze, his hands stilled on the cool steel of his rifle. He looked up, meeting her gaze. The sound of her voice was a shock, a sudden intrusion of humanity into their pantomime of survival. She saw the question in his eyes. "My name," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "It is Enola." It wasn't an introduction offered to a stranger. It was not a plea for recognition. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of self. In the face of a world that had tried to erase her, to label her as refuse, savage, property, she had reclaimed her name. She was not the Apache woman, not the prisoner, not the $5 purchase. She was Enola. Elias held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the flicker of fire in her eyes, the same unbroken spirit he had seen at the hitching post. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was the only answer that was needed. From that moment, the invisible wall between them did not just crack, it crumbled. The real encounter was not the violent, public spectacle in Dust Devil Gulch. It was this quiet moment in a small, lonely cabin, when a woman who had lost everything else chose to share the one thing they could never take from her, her name. And a man who had walled himself off from the world chose, by a simple nod, to let someone in. She finally spoke her name, a single word that changes everything. If you felt the power in that moment, comment number 3. What he doesn't know is that a name is just the beginning of who she is. And the peace they're building is about to be tested by a storm. The weeks that followed were a quiet alchemy. The raw, distrustful elements of their first encounter began to transmute into something else, something solid and unspoken. Their relationship was not a storm. It was not a sudden, violent downpour of emotion. It was an underground river, silent and unseen, carving a new path through the bedrock of their shared solitude. It was a current that grew stronger with each passing day, fed by small, quiet tributaries of action. It was built from the routines they established, the rituals of survival that slowly became rituals of coexistence. It was in the way Elias, returning from a rare trip to a trading post miles away, would leave a small bolt of dark blue calico cloth on the table without a word. It wasn't a gift. It was a simple acknowledgement that the rags she had salvaged could not last forever. It was in the way Enola, finding the cloth, would simply nod to herself, and days later Elias would see her wearing a new, simple dress of her own making, the fit perfect, the stitches immaculate. There was no exchange of thanks or praise. The action was the entire conversation. The respect was in the utility of the gesture. It was in the way she mended a tear in his old canvas jacket, her stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, making the worn fabric stronger than it had been before. It was in the way he started leaving his rifle by the hearth instead of taking it with him to the barn at night, an unconscious signal of trust he himself didn't fully recognize until he saw it there one morning. It was in the shared meals, where the silence was no longer a void but a comfortable space, punctuated only by the scrape of a fork on a tin plate or the crackle of the fire. They were two solitary planets that had drifted into the same orbit, held there by a quiet, invisible gravity. He learned the rhythm of her movements, the way she would pause by the window at sunset and stare out at the distant hills, her expression unreadable but profound. She learned the map of his moods from the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders when he returned from a long ride. This fragile peace, however, was a thing of the plains, born of isolation, and the plains were about to be invaded. The storm came on a Tuesday night. It arrived with a sudden violent fury, as if the sky itself were trying to tear the world apart. The wind, a low moan at first, rose to a shrieking banshee, rattling the cabin's single window in its frame. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the wooden roof like 1,000 angry fists. A flash of lightning would momentarily bleach the world white, followed a heartbeat later by a crack of thunder so deep and concussive it shook the very foundations of the small cabin. Inside, the fire in the hearth spat and hissed. Elias had bolted the door and wedged a chair under the handle. Enola sat at the table, her hands still, her gaze fixed on the flames. In the flickering light, her face was a mask of calm, a small, still point in the roaring chaos. Elias stood by the window, watching the storm, feeling the wildness of it resonate with something deep inside him. It was a night when the world felt small and vulnerable, a night when any sane creature would be huddled in its den. That's when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm, a drunken, slurred shout, barely audible over the wind. Elias tensed, his body going rigid. He moved away from the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he had left, leaning against the wall. He saw Enola's head lift, her eyes sharp, alert. She had heard it too. Then came the pounding on the door, heavy, clumsy, insistent. "Vance, I know you're in there, you damn hermit, and I know you got what's mine." Elias recognized the voice. Corporal Davies, one of the soldiers who had been at the sheriff's office that day, his face flushed with cheap whiskey and mean-spirited laughter. Elias's jaw tightened, a muscle knotting in his cheek. He looked at Enola. Her face was impassive, but her eyes were like chips of obsidian, hard and knowing. She knew who it was. "Open up, Vance," the voice roared, followed by a kick that made the door shudder. "That Apache bitch is government property. I'm here to repossess her. It's my turn." Rage, cold and pure, surged through Elias. It was the rage of a man who had seen too much injustice, too much ugliness. He picked up the rifle. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. He checked the action with a swift, practiced motion. He looked at Enola one last time. She didn't move. She just watched him, her gaze unwavering. It was not a look of fear. It was a look of absolute, terrifying faith. He walked to the door, pulled the chair away, and lifted the bar. He wrenched the door open. Davies stumbled forward, caught off guard, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand, his uniform soaked, his face a caricature of drunken lust and entitlement. The wind and rain howled into the cabin. Davies's eyes widened as he saw the barrel of the rifle leveled directly at his chest. "Vance, get out of here," Elias said. His voice was not loud. It was low, flat, and colder than the rain. It held the finality of a spadeful of dirt on a coffin lid. Davies blinked, trying to focus. The drunken bravado on his face began to curdle into confusion, then fear, as he registered the look in Elias's eyes. It was a look he had seen before, in the eyes of men on the brink of killing. It was a look that promised nothing but a swift and violent end. It's just a squaw," he stammered, taking a clumsy step back. "She's in my home," Elias said, his voice dropping even lower. "And you are not. You have 3 seconds before I correct that." He cocked the hammer of the rifle. The click was louder than the thunder. That was all it took. The fear finally broke through the alcoholic haze. Davies turned and scrambled away into the storm, slipping and sliding in the mud like the pathetic creature he was, swallowed by the roaring darkness. Elias watched him go, then slowly, deliberately, closed the door, barred it, and put the chair back. He leaned the rifle against the wall and turned. Enola was standing right behind him, not by the fire, but there, in the center of the room. The storm raged outside, but inside, a new and more profound silence had fallen. The external threat was gone, but the questions it had raised hung in the air between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Why?" she asked. It was a single word, but it held a universe of meaning. "Why did you do that? Why did you stand for me? Why did you buy me?" Elias walked to the fire, his back to her. He stared into the flames, seeing not the burning wood, but the faces of all the men and women he had failed to save, the injustices he had turned away from. He had lived his life by a code of non-interference, and it had brought him nothing but a hollowed-out soul. He finally understood the real reason he had acted that day in town. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. He turned to face her, and for the first time he let her see past the walls into the scarred and empty rooms of his heart. His voice was raw, stripped of all artifice. "Because no one else would," he said. He paused, the truth of it settling between them. "And because you didn't kneel." The silence that followed was absolute. He had given her the truest thing he owned. He had answered not just her question, but the question of his own existence. He watched as Enola absorbed his words. Her expression did not change, but he saw something shift deep in her eyes, a flicker of understanding, of recognition. She crossed the small space between them. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. She reached up, her small, calloused hand gently touching his jaw. Then she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion or of gratitude. It was a kiss of choice. It was a solemn, deliberate act, a seal, a pact. She pulled back slowly, her eyes holding his. "I will stay," she said. And Elias Vance knew it was not a promise, it was a vow. He didn't save her because he was kind. He saved her because she was strong. If that reason hit you right in the gut, comment number 4. These stories of the West are fueled by your support, so hit that like button, share the legend, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. Because her vow to stay will transform more than just the man. It will transform the land itself. The morning after the storm, the world was washed clean. The air, stripped of its dust and heat, was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and sage. The sky was a vast, brilliant blue, scarred by not a single cloud. The fury had passed, and in its wake it had left a profound and altered silence. It was no longer the silence of emptiness or of a ceasefire. It was the quiet of a foundation being laid. Enola's vow, spoken in the heart of the storm, had not been carried away by the wind. It had settled into the bedrock of the ranch, into the very timbers of the small cabin. I will stay. It was a choice, a declaration that had changed everything. Enola was no longer the ghost who haunted the corners of his home, nor the prisoner he had ransomed from a cruel and indifferent world. She was becoming its heart. The transformation was not sudden or loud. It was a quiet, deliberate reclamation, an unfolding of a spirit that had been folded into itself for protection. It began with the earth. One morning, Elias saw her standing by the well, staring at a patch of ground a few yards from the cabin. It was a barren, forgotten spot, littered with rocks and baked hard by years of relentless sun. To him, it was just another piece of useless dirt. To her, it was potential. For days, she worked that small plot of land with a singular, unyielding focus. She cleared the rocks, her small hands prying them from the compacted soil, stacking them one by one into a low, neat wall. She broke up the earth with a rusted spade she'd found in the barn, her movements rhythmic and tireless. Elias watched her from a distance, a silent observer of this strange, patient ritual. He didn't understand. This was not land for farming, it was land for surviving. But she was not just surviving anymore. From the depths of his supply chest, she unearthed a small canvas sack he had forgotten he owned, filled with dried beans and kernels of corn, hard, unpromising seeds meant for lean times. She took them, and with her fingers, she pressed each one into the soil she had so painstakingly prepared. She watered it every morning with the bucket she drew herself, her shadow long in the early light. It was an act of profound and defiant faith. She was planting a future in a place that had no memory of one. She was coaxing life from a patch of ground that everyone, including Elias, had given up for dead. And as the first, tender green shoots began to push their way through the dark soil, another change began. Sound started to seep back into their world. At first, it was almost imperceptible. While she worked in her small, burgeoning garden, a low hum would rise from her, a melody without words. It was a sound as natural as the buzz of a bee, a private, unconscious tune. Then, slowly, it grew. It became a soft, quiet song, the words in a language Elias did not understand, but whose meaning he could feel in his bones. It was a song of her people, a thread of her past she was weaving into the fabric of their present. For 9 years, the only sounds in Elias's life had been the wind, the cry of a lone hawk, and the grim, monotonous rhythm of his own thoughts. Her voice was an intrusion, but one that did not violate the silence. It filled it. It gave it warmth. It was the sound of a soul remembering itself. Her transformation rippled outward, touching everything, including him. The ranch was no longer just a place to sleep and take shelter from the elements. It became a home. He would return from a long ride to find the scent of baking bread filling the cabin, a smell so deeply connected to a life he thought he had lost forever that it would stop him in his tracks. He would find a small clay pot on the windowsill, holding a spray of hardy purple wildflowers. He had never noticed wildflowers on his land before. He started to see the world through her eyes, a world not just of threats and hardships, but of small, resilient beauties. And Elias Vance began to change. The hollowed-out soldier, the man who had wrapped himself in a shroud of solitude, began to feel the thaw. The deep lines of pain etched around his eyes seemed to soften. The weight that had permanently stooped his shoulders seemed to lift, just a fraction. It was Enola who did it, without trying, simply by being. One afternoon, he was fixing a loose hinge on the corral gate when one of the chickens, she had started tending a flock that had appeared as if by magic from a trade with a passing tinker, escaped her enclosure and led her on a clumsy, comical chase around the yard. He watched her, a woman who had faced down death and degradation, now scolding a stubborn hen with a mock seriousness, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. And Elias Vance smiled. It was not a grin, it was not a laugh. It was a small, quiet, unaccustomed cracking of the stone facade he had worn for a decade. The feeling was so foreign on his face that he instinctively raised a hand to his mouth, as if to hide it. But it was there. It was real, a genuine smile, born of a shared moment of simple, unexpected life. In that moment, he was no longer just her protector, he was her partner. He was no longer a man with a past to escape, but a man with a present to defend. The miracle of Enola was not that she had endured, it was that she had chosen to create. She had taken the barren ground of their lives and cultivated a garden. She took his fortress and made it a hearth. She did not regain her strength by fighting the world that had wronged her, but by building a new one, a better one, in its place. She proved, with every green shoot that broke the soil, with every quiet song she sang to the setting sun, that dignity could not be bought for $5 or stripped away by ropes and ridicule. It was a seed carried within, waiting only for a patch of ground, however rocky, in which to grow. Elias Vance's ranch was no longer a hiding place at the edge of the world. It was the center of it. It had become a home. She's not just a survivor, she's a creator, turning barren ground into a garden. If you believe one person's spirit can bring anything back to life, leave a number 5 in the comments. But peace like this in the Old West is a magnet for trouble, and the outside world has a long memory. The garden flourished. Under Enola's patient hand, the stubborn Texas soil yielded green beans, yellow squash, and rows of corn that grew tall and proud against the endless blue sky. The fragile peace they had forged in the heart of the storm settled into a quiet, steady rhythm. But peace, in this land, was a shallow-rooted crop. The world outside their small sanctuary had a long and unforgiving memory. Trouble did not send a warning. It simply arrived, a cloud of dust on the horizon, a dark omen under the white-hot afternoon sun. Elias saw them first. 3 riders moving with the lazy, arrogant confidence of men who believe the law is on their side because they are the ones holding the guns. He recognized the portly figure in the lead immediately. Sheriff Bloodline. Elias felt a familiar coldness settle in his gut, the calm that always preceded a fight. He laid down the axe he'd been using to split wood and walked to the cabin. Enola was inside, grinding corn into meal, the rhythmic sound of the stone a peaceful heartbeat in the home. She looked up as he entered, her hands stilling. She did not need to ask. She had seen the look on his face before. He took his rifle from its pegs on the wall. The weight of it was a grim comfort. "Stay inside," he said. It was not a command, it was a statement of intent. He would meet this threat at the door. He stepped onto the porch just as the 3 men rode into the yard, their horses kicking up dust that settled on Enola's bean plants like a foul blight. Bodine reined in his horse, a sneer twisting his fleshy face. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their eyes dull and incurious, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. They were men who followed orders without question. "Vance," Bodine said, his voice thick with smug authority. "I knew we'd be having this conversation sooner or later." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, narrowly missing the edge of the garden. "Been hearing whispers. Seems my government property decided to make a home for itself out here." Elias said nothing. He stood on the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side, his body relaxed but ready. His stillness was a challenge, a wall of silent refusal that Bodine seemed determined to break himself against. "The federal marshals have put out a new directive," Bodine continued, puffing out his chest. "All stray Apache are to be rounded up and returned to the reservation at San Carlos. It's for their own good, you understand. Orderly, official." He leaned forward in his saddle. "So, I'm here to collect what's mine. Or rather, what belongs to the United States government. I'll be taking the squaw back with me. Now, You can make this easy, or he let the threat hang in the air. The cabin door opened. Enola stepped out and stood beside Elias. She wore the simple blue dress she had made. Her hair was tied back, and her face was a mask of calm composure. She looked at Bloodline not with fear, but with a cool, dismissive contempt that seemed to enrage him more than any defiance from Elias. "It's out of your hands now, Vance," Bloodline snarled, his face turning a blotchy red. "That thing is property, and I'm here to repossess it." Elias raised the rifle. He didn't aim it, he just held it, the barrel pointing toward the ground. But the gesture was unmistakable. It was the drawing of a line. "She is not property," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard with the deadly clarity of a rattlesnake's warning. Each word was a carefully placed stone, hard, unmovable. He took a half-step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Enola. "She is my home." The air went tight. The two hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles, their eyes darting from Elias's cold, flint-like gaze to their boss. They were paid to intimidate, not to die. And they saw in Elias Vance a man who had made his peace with dying, and who was more than willing to take them with him. His eyes were not the eyes of a rancher protecting his land. They were the eyes of a soldier on a battlefield, holding the last defensive position. There was no room for negotiation in that gaze. There was only the promise of a grave. Bloodline saw it too. The smugness on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He was a bully, accustomed to his authority going unchallenged. He had expected a shouting match, a reluctant, resentful surrender. He had not expected to be staring down the barrel of his own mortality. He looked at Elias, then at the unwavering woman beside him, and he understood. He had lost before he had even begun. He had come to collect a broken thing, and he had found a fortress. "You're a damned fool, Vance," Bloodline spat, trying to salvage a shred of his dignity. "You'll hang for this, harboring a fugitive." Elias cocked the rifle. The sound, a sharp, metallic click-clack, was the only answer Bloodline needed. The sheriff jerked his reins, pulling his horse around so sharply it whinnied in protest. "Let's go," he growled at his men. They didn't need to be told twice. The three of them galloped out of the yard, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of their own cowardice hanging in the air. Elias stood motionless until they were a distant speck on the horizon. He slowly uncocked the rifle. He could feel Enola's presence beside him, her breathing slow and steady. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew this was not the end. They had defied the law of the white man, and that law had a long reach and a cruel memory. The aftermath of the confrontation was a new kind of silence. The easy peace was gone, replaced by a constant, humming vigilance. Elias started wearing his pistol again, even when doing chores around the ranch. Enola's songs grew quieter, more infrequent. They were no longer just two people building a life. They were guardians of a fragile sanctuary, watching the horizon for the next wave of the world's ugliness. The next visitor came weeks later. It was a lone rider, and Elias had his rifle in hand before the boy was even halfway to the cabin. But this was not a threat. It was a youth, no more than 15, with earnest, curious eyes and a nervous way of holding his horse's reins. He looked less like a danger and more like a pilgrim. Elias met him in the yard, his stance wary. "What do you want, boy?" The boy swallowed, his eyes darting from Elias to the cabin, where Enola had appeared in the doorway, watching. I just came to see," he stammered. "The story. Everyone in town is talking." He looked directly at Enola then, his voice dropping to a whisper of awe. "Is it true, what they say, that when they had you tied up, you didn't cry? You didn't even speak?" Enola stepped forward. She looked at the boy, and her expression softened. He was not here to mock or to threaten. He was here to understand. She gave a single, slow nod. The boy's eyes widened. A look of profound admiration washed over his young face. "My ma, She says, "You're the last of the Apache round here," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that was more powerful than any weapon. "But she says, you're stronger than all of us." He stared for a moment longer, as if memorizing her face, then turned his horse. I had to see for myself. He rode away, leaving not a cloud of dust, but a stunned silence in his wake. Elias and Enola stood in the yard, the setting sun casting their long shadows across the ground. They looked at each other, and in that shared glance, a new and heavy understanding passed between them. Their private struggle, their quiet story of survival and defiance, was no longer their own. It had escaped the confines of the ranch and become a legend. A story told in whispers in a town that had once scorned them. They were not just a man and a woman anymore. They were a symbol. And they knew, with a certainty that was both a burden and a source of strength, that they would have to spend the rest of their lives defending not just their home, but the truth of the legend they had become. They stood their ground, and now their story is becoming a legend. Who do you think was more powerful in that moment? The sheriff with the law or the boy with his respect? Tell us by commenting number 6. If you stand with them, show your support with a like, a share, and by subscribing to the channel, because you can't run from a legend, and Elias is about to make a decision that will force a final showdown. The legend of the Apache woman and the hermit who defended her grew like a prairie fire after a lightning strike. It was a story told in hushed tones in the general store, a tale debated over warm beer in the saloon. It made them a curiosity, a local myth, but a myth could not protect them. The law was a patient predator, and Sheriff Bodine was a man whose pride had been wounded. A wound like that, left to fester in a small man, always turned venomous. Elias knew they were living on borrowed time. The confrontation at the ranch had been a battle, not the war. The war would be fought on Bodine's terms, in his town, where the law was whatever he said it was. Hiding was no longer an option. To hide was to admit guilt. It was to live as fugitives, always looking over their shoulders, waiting for the inevitable boot on the door. It was a slow death, a surrender by inches. The boy's visit had shown Elias that their story was a symbol of something more than just their own survival. To run would be to let that symbol die. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, the sky, a tapestry of bruised purple and fiery orange, Elias made a decision. It was a decision born not of desperation, but of a cold, hard clarity. They could not wait for the world to come to them again. They would go to the world. He looked at Enola, her profile etched against the dying light. "We're going back," he said. His voice was quiet, but it held the weight of a final judgment. "Tomorrow, we're going back to town." Enola turned to him, her dark eyes searching his. She saw no fear there, only a grim, unshakable resolve. She understood immediately. This was not a retreat, it was an advance. She did not speak. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate affirmation. The decision was made. They would face the beast in its own den. The next morning they prepared not for a trip to buy supplies, but for a procession, for a coronation. Enola did not wear the simple work dress she had made. From a small wooden chest, she took out the bolt of dark blue calico cloth Elias had brought her weeks ago. She had been saving it. All day, she worked, her needle flying with a silent, focused intensity. She was not just sewing a dress, she was crafting armor. When she was finished, she emerged from the cabin, and for a moment, Elias could not breathe. This was not the broken woman from the hitching post. This was not the quiet homesteader who tended a garden. The dress was simple in its design, but it fit her with a grace that spoke of an innate, unshakable dignity. She had washed her hair, and it hung like a sheet of polished black silk down her back, held in place by a single leather tie. Around her neck, she wore a simple necklace of polished stones and bird feathers she had made herself. She looked regal. She looked like the last queen of a fallen nation, her spirit unvanquished, her pride a brilliant, burning flame. Elias saddled Bones, and for the first time he brought out the old, half-broken mare that had been living out her days on his land. He helped Enola mount, his hand briefly touching hers. It was a touch of solidarity, of a shared and unspoken purpose. They rode not side by side, but with him slightly behind, an honor guard for the Queen. Their arrival in Dust Devil Gulch was a spectacle. As they rode down the main street, a hush fell over the town. Porches emptied, saloon doors swung open, faces appeared in dusty windows. People stopped what they were doing and simply stared. The whispers died, the jeers were strangled in the throat. This was not the sight they had expected. They had expected a hermit dragging his captive squaw. They saw a woman of immense and quiet power, riding with her head held high, her gaze fixed forward, sweeping over their small, miserable town with an air of absolute indifference. She did not look at them. She did not acknowledge their existence. Her silence was more powerful than any weapon, her composure more intimidating than any threat. She was not the subject of their story anymore. She was the author of it, and she was riding into town to write the final chapter. They did not stop until they reached the sheriff's office, the very spot where she had been tied like an animal. The place of her deepest humiliation was now the stage for her ultimate triumph. Elias dismounted and helped her down. They did not walk to the door. They simply stood there, in the center of the dusty street, and waited. They were the destination. The world would have to come to them. And it did. Sheriff Bodine emerged from his office, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been expecting to hunt them down like dogs in the wilderness. He had not expected them to walk willingly into his grasp, and to do it with such arrogance. The entire town was watching, a silent, captive audience. Bodine's authority depended on the perception of his power, and at this moment he looked powerless. He strode toward them, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. "Vance, what in the hell do you think you're doing?" He blustered, his voice a little too loud, betraying his unease. "I told you what would happen. You're under arrest." And she... He gestured at Enola with a contemptuous flick of his hand. Enola met his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not a victim, but a judge. She's still here," Bodine stammered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her silent dignity. It was a stupid, obvious thing to say, the statement of a man whose script had been torn up. Elias placed a hand on Enola's shoulder. It was not a gesture of restraint or of ownership. It was a gesture of solidarity. A silent statement that they stood together. He looked Bodine directly in the eye, his own gaze as hard and unforgiving as granite. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout. It was a low, clear pronouncement that carried across the unnaturally silent square. "She will always be here." It was not a threat. It was not a challenge. It was a simple statement of fact, a truth that settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. She will always be here, in this town, in this land. In this story, in that moment, the entire town finally understood. They were not witnessing the arrest of a fugitive. They were witnessing the crowning of a survivor. Enola was not a captive. She was not a purchase. She was not a squaw. She had not been taken. She had chosen. She had chosen to stay, chosen to build a life, chosen to face them not with weapons, but with a spirit they could not break. Bodine stood frozen, his hand still on his gun. He could arrest them, yes. He could throw them in his jail. But he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had already lost. To arrest them now would be to make them martyrs. To let them go would be to admit his own impotence. He looked around at the faces of the townspeople. He saw no mockery, no bloodlust. He saw only a stunned, grudging respect. They were not looking at him, their sheriff. They were looking at the Apache woman. Enola's dignity had won. Her courage had defeated their cruelty. She had faced them at their worst, and she had not knelt. And now, by simply returning, she had forced them to see her not as they wanted to see her, but as she truly was, unbroken. She returned to the site of her greatest humiliation as a queen. If you believe dignity is the ultimate weapon, prove it by commenting, Number 7. Bloodline was left powerless, but the story isn't over. The final resolution happens not in the town square, but back at the heart of it all. They rode away from Dust Devil Gulch as the sun began to dip below the horizon, leaving behind a town shrouded in a stunned and altered silence. They had not won a battle with guns or with fists. They had won with something far more powerful, the undeniable truth of their own existence. The ride home was different from all the rides that had come before. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution or of unspoken questions. It was a shared peace, a quiet understanding as vast and as deep as the star-dusted sky that was beginning to unfold above them. They had walked into the lion's den, faced their ghosts, and had walked out not just unscathed, but whole. Back at the ranch, the small cabin felt different. It was no longer a refuge from the world. It was the center of it. It was a sanctuary they had not just defended, but had consecrated with their courage. Elias built a fire in the hearth, the flames leaping up to cast a warm, dancing glow on the familiar walls. Enola prepared a simple meal of roasted corn and dried meat. They ate at the small table, the silence comfortable, the air filled only with the crackle of the fire and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. There were no more battles to be fought, no more threats looming on the horizon. There was only this quiet, this peace, this home. After they had eaten, they sat before the fire, Elias in his chair, Enola on a blanket on the floor, her back resting against his legs. He gently ran his fingers through her long, dark hair, the simple, tender gesture, a conversation in itself. For a long time they just watched the flames, two solitary souls who had found their anchor in each other. The world outside, with its noise and its judgment, felt 1,000,000 miles away. Then Enola shifted, turning to look up at him. In the flickering firelight, her eyes held a depth and a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the land itself. She had a final question for him, one that had nothing to do with the white man's world of sheriffs and laws, but with her own world, the one she carried inside her. "Would you take my name?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Elias paused, his hands stilling in her hair. He did not understand. He looked down at her, a question in his eyes. "In my tribe," she explained, her voice a quiet river of history, when a woman is the last of her line, when she has endured all that the world can throw at her, and still she stands, the man who stands with her, the man who honors her spirit, he takes her name. It is not a surrender of his own. It is a joining. It shows that her strength is now his strength, that her survival is now his, that her story will not die. Elias looked at the woman before him, the woman who had been sold for $5, who had been starved and mocked and threatened, the woman who had taken a barren patch of his soul and planted a garden in it. She had taught him that survival was not just about enduring, but about creating. She had shown him that strength was not in the hardness of a fist, but in the resilience of a spirit that refused to kneel. She had given him back a life he thought he had buried forever on a distant battlefield. He had bought her freedom with a handful of coins, but she had bought his with a courage that was priceless. To take her name was not a duty. It was the highest honor he could possibly imagine. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time in his life, Elias Vance felt a sense of absolute, profound peace. The ghosts of the war were silent. The emptiness that had been his constant companion for a decade was filled. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. A rare, beautiful smile bloomed on Enola's face. It was a smile that reached her eyes, lighting them from within. "My name," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Enola. It means the one who endures, the turtle. It lives long, and it always stays." Elias took her hand, his large, calloused fingers lacing through her smaller, stronger ones. He held it tightly, a silent vow passing between them. He looked from her face to the fire, then back again. The future was no longer a threat. It was a promise. "I will stay too," he answered. There was no wedding in a church, no piece of paper signed by a judge, no vows sworn before God. Their union was forged in a trial by fire, their vows declared in quiet acts of courage and sealed in a shared understanding that transcended any law or ceremony. But from that day forward, the entire territory knew. The legend of the hermit and the Apache woman changed. She was no longer just the woman Elias Vance had bought. He was the man who belonged to Enola. The story lived on, passed down from one generation to the next. They said that peace settled on that small patch of land, a peace so profound that even the most brutal Texas winters seemed to gentler there. They said the garden always flourished, and that the sound of quiet singing could often be heard on the wind. They lived a long life together, a quiet testament to the fact that love is not about finding a perfect person, but about finding a broken soul whose fractured pieces fit perfectly with your own. Elias Vance was not her savior, and Enola was not his. They were two survivors who had saved each other, and in the heart of a cruel and unforgiving land, they had built more than just a home. They had built a world. He didn't just save her life, she gave him a reason to live his. A perfect ending to a story of two broken souls. If their story moved you, leave a final, number 8, as a salute to them. Thank you for riding with us on this journey, and we'll see you on the next tale from the Wild West. And so, the story of Elias and Enola comes to a close, not with a gunshot, but with a quiet vow under a sky full of stars. For me, this tale resonates so deeply because it's not about loud heroism. It's about the profound power of quiet strength and the courage of a single, decent choice. It's a powerful reminder that in our own lives, the world will constantly try to label us, to put us in a box based on its own judgments. Enola's journey teaches us that our dignity is not something granted by others. It is a fortress we build from within. No one can take it unless we hand them the keys. And then there's Elias, a man who reminds us that sometimes the most courageous act is to break our own comfortable rules of solitude and self-preservation to do what is simply right. His single, decisive action didn't just save a life, it redeemed his own, pulling him back from the ghosts of his past. This story challenges us to look at our own lives. We may not face down armed men, but we face moments of injustice every day, moments where it's easier to look away. It asks us, when the time comes, will we have the courage to offer a hand, to stand our ground? True strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the steady hand, the unwavering spirit, the person who chooses decency in an indecent world, proving that even two broken souls can rebuild a life more whole than any they had before. What's the one lesson from their story that you'll carry with you? Let me know in the comments below. If these tales of the Old West speak to your soul, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and join our posse for more stories of courage, conflict, and redemption.